The train's whistle shrieked across the barren plain, a sound so sharp it seemed to slice the horizon in two. Dust lifted in slow spirals as the engine groaned to a halt, its iron bulk hissing like some tired beast that had carried too many souls westward. When the doors opened, a scatter of travelers spilled out, miners with soot in their lungs, women clutching parcels tied with fraying string, children clinging to skirts like shadows. And then, last of all, stepped Eleanor Whitfield. Her dress was blue once, the shade of morning sky before the sun burns it pale, but travel had dulled it to the color of worn stone. She clutched a carpet-bag so small it seemed to carry more sorrow than belongings. For a moment she stood still on the platform, letting the heat press down on her and the eyes of strangers weigh heavier still. A letter folded in her pocket told her this was to be her new beginning. A man, a rancher, had sent for her. Yet as she lifted her gaze, no welcoming face stepped forward, no hand reached out to guide her from the platform. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, as though the earth beneath her might not hold. Her breath carried the faint perfume of nervousness, iron ink from letters, soap worn thin from careful scrubbing, the trace of lavender tucked into her bag by a sister who had whispered goodbye with trembling lips. Eleanor had come west to be chosen, to belong, yet she felt already like an interloper in a land of hard lines and harder hearts. At the far edge of the platform stood a man in a pressed vest, hat angled against the sun. His mustache was trimmed sharp, his boots polished as though the dust feared to touch them. This, she thought, must be the one. Her intended. He had written of a ranch, of needing a wife to help tend it, of loneliness clawing at him since his mother's passing. She lifted her hand slightly, heart quickening with both hope and dread. But when their eyes met, his expression shifted like a cloud covering light. He did not smile, did not lift a hand in greeting. Instead, he frowned, muttered something beneath his breath, and after a long pause, stepped toward her. "You're Eleanor Whitfield." His voice was flat, clipped, carrying more disappointment than welcome. She nodded, throat too tight for words. He looked her over as though inspecting a horse brought for auction. His mouth pulled taut. "I thought," he stopped, then exhaled sharply. "You're not what I pictured." The words fell like stones, each one striking some tender place she had guarded on the long journey west. Around them, townsfolk had paused, curiosity pricking ears. She felt the prickle of their eyes, the whispers beginning to coil like smoke. Eleanor drew a careful breath. "The letters," she said softly. "You asked me to come." "I asked for a wife," he snapped quietly, though not quietly enough. "A strong woman. Someone who could keep a house and stand the winters. You," his gaze flicked over her slender form, the paleness of travel still clinging to her cheeks. "You'll not do." She flinched, though her body refused to bow. A quiet strength rose in her even as shame burned her skin. "I crossed half a country," she whispered, though he had already turned away. His boots struck the platform boards with finality, carrying him off into the crowd, leaving her alone. Alone before them all. The murmurs thickened. A woman with gray hair tucked into a severe bun leaned toward another. "Foolish girl, chasing dreams that don't want her." Another voice, harsher, "What man wants a bride too frail to carry water?" The whispers pierced deeper than any blade, each one stitching humiliation into her bones. Sheriff Amos Greeley, broad-shouldered and worn by years of watching men destroy themselves with pride, stepped forward. "Miss Whitfield," he said gently, though pity shadowed his eyes. "There's a room above the saloon for a night or two. We'll see about your fare back east, if that's what you want." Her lips trembled but she forced them steady. "Thank you, Sheriff." As he guided her off the platform, she felt the townsfolk stares following. Their judgment clung to her like burrs caught in fabric. She wanted to flee, to vanish into the horizon, but her feet obeyed only the sheriff's slow, steady lead. That night, in the narrow room lit by a single wavering candle, Eleanor sat at a desk scarred with the carvings of forgotten names. She unfolded paper, dipped pen into ink, and tried to write, "Dearest sister, I have arrived but, the words blurred as tears fell, staining the page until it looked as though the paper itself mourned with her. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, I am not what they pictured. Outside, laughter echoed from the saloon, heavy with whiskey and careless joy. She lay on the narrow bed, listening to it as though it were the voice of a world that would never open its arms to her. Sleep came slow and cruel, bringing dreams of doors closing one after another, until only darkness remained. Morning broke with bells calling the town to church. Eleanor dressed with deliberate care, smoothing her skirt as though order might restore some fragment of dignity. She walked through the streets, each face turning toward her, each whisper a reminder of her public rejection. When she stepped inside the church, silence flickered. No one offered her space on a pew. She stood alone at the back, hands folded tightly. The hymns rose, voices mingling like threads woven into cloth. Yet she felt the edges fraying where she stood. It was then, during a pause, that she felt the soft tug of a smaller hand against her skirt. She looked down. A child stood there, golden curls tangled, eyes the color of spring leaves after rain. 6 years old, perhaps 7. She stared up with such open longing that Eleanor's breath caught. The girl leaned closer, voice no louder than a sigh, yet sharp enough to pierce Eleanor's despair. Can you be my mommy? The church blurred around her, the wooden beams, the painted windows, the faces turned away. All she saw was this child, Clara, though she did not yet know her name. The words hung in the air, fragile as glass, yet heavy with meaning. Eleanor's lips parted but no answer came. Her heart thundered, carrying both fear and wonder. She knelt slowly, trembling hands reaching though not yet touching, as if to move too quick might shatter the moment. Her eyes filled, but these were not tears of shame. They were something else, something new, something terrifying. The child smiled, small and sure, before slipping back to her pew beside a tall man whose shoulders carried both strength and sorrow. He glanced at Eleanor, his expression unreadable, but his daughter's gaze lingered, tethering Eleanor's heart to a possibility she dared not name. Eleanor sank back against the wall, her body trembling. The hymn resumed, voices filling the air again, yet for her the world had changed. The rejection, the whispers, the ache of solitude, all of it still clung to her. But beneath it, like a seed pressed into soil, something had been planted. And though she told herself not to hope, she felt it anyway. A whisper, a question, a child's plea that carried more promise than any man's letter ever had. The service ended. Sunlight spilled through the church doors, casting long beams across the floor. People filed out, murmuring to one another, their glances darting toward Eleanor with judgment sharpened by curiosity. She stood very still, letting them pass, until only the man and his daughter remained. The girl smiled once more, unafraid, while the man placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Eleanor lowered her eyes, heart still pounding. She did not know what this meant, or what would come of it, only that her journey had not ended with rejection on a platform. Something larger had begun, something that frightened and steadied her all at once. Outside, the wind lifted dust along the street, carrying whispers through the town. Eleanor stepped out into the light, her shadow stretching long before her, uncertain but unbroken. And in the quiet of her chest, she carried the echo of a child's words, words that would not let her go. The days that followed unfolded like pages torn slowly from a book, each one marred by whispers, yet marked also by the quiet persistence of Eleanor's spirit. The rejection at the platform had branded her in the eyes of the town, a woman unwanted, a figure of pity or ridicule depending on who spoke. Yet she refused to collapse beneath their weight. Instead, she rose each morning and walked through the dusty streets with her head held just enough to suggest dignity, though her heart trembled with the effort. She began to help where no one had asked for help. A boy stumbled near the well with a bucket too heavy for his arms, and Eleanor carried it for him without ceremony. A widow's sleeve tore in the market, and Eleanor's fingers, deft from years of needlework, repaired it before the woman could even mutter thanks. She planted flowers in the hard soil beside the boarding house, coaxing fragile blooms from earth the town had long since abandoned to dust. These were small things, unnoticed by many, mocked by some, yet they steadied her. Through them she discovered a strange kind of survival, not through being wanted, but through giving what she still had to give. It was during these quiet acts that Clara began to appear like a shadow cast by light. At first, she lingered from afar, peeking around corners, watching Eleanor mend or carry or kneel in the dirt with her flowers. Then, bolder, she would run to her side, slipping a small hand into hers as if it had always belonged there. Clara spoke little, but her eyes carried oceans, and each glance felt like a bomb pressed into Eleanor's wounded heart. The father, Thomas McGraw, watched too, though at a distance. A widower of 3 years, his grief had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his silence was as heavy as stone. He was a man the town respected but did not quite know, his presence reliable as rain, his temper seldom shone. It was said he had buried his wife beneath the cottonwoods on his ranch and had not spoken of her since. Clara was all he had left, and his devotion to her was fierce yet quiet, the kind of love that built walls rather than opened doors. Eleanor noticed him noticing her, though he gave no sign beyond the faintest nod when their eyes met. It was not interest, not yet, it was something quieter, more cautious, like a man measuring whether the ground beneath his boots would hold. Still, that glance was enough to keep her walking, enough to keep her breathing through the town's sharp stares. The summer deepened, and with it came the annual town picnic. Eleanor debated not attending, fearing the cruelty of whispers in the open air, but Clara's pleading eyes drew her there. The meadow stretched wide, tables laden with pies and cornbread, fiddles tuning as children ran wild. Eleanor stood at the edge, her palms damp, until Clara darted to her side and clung to her skirts with unabashed joy. "Mama," the child said, her voice bright as sunlight. The words struck the meadow like a bell. Conversations faltered, forks stilled midway to mouths, and every head turned toward Eleanor. A flush rose in her cheeks as laughter rippled from Mrs. Boone, sharp and scornful. "Mama," the old widow repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "Out of the mouths of babes, what nonsense they'll speak." Eleanor froze, torn between denying and clinging to the word, when Thomas McGraw stepped forward. He did not rebuke his daughter, nor did he push Eleanor aside. Instead, he placed a steady hand on Clara's shoulder, his silence louder than any defense. He met Eleanor's eyes then, and in that brief exchange she saw neither pity nor derision, only recognition, as if he too heard in his daughter's voice something truer than gossip. The moment passed, but it left the town unsettled. Whispers swelled, some cruel, some curious, yet Eleanor walked through them with Clara's hand in hers, her steps no longer faltering. She had been called unwanted, too plain, too frail, but in that word, spoken by a child, she had been given a place. Not long after, a storm rolled across the plains, black clouds tumbling like armies at war. Rain lashed the earth, and winds tore branches from trees. Eleanor had gone with Thomas and Clara to fetch supplies from town, and they were returning when the river swelled beyond its banks. The bridge they meant to cross groaned under the weight of water, each board trembling with the threat of collapse. Thomas dismounted, lifting Clara into his arms, but the child wriggled free, eager to prove herself brave. She darted ahead, her small boots slipping on the soaked wood. Eleanor cried out, reaching for her, but in an instant Clara's foot slid, her body pitching toward the torrent below. Without thought, Eleanor lunged. Her hands caught Clara's dress just as the river roared beneath, pulling with a force that threatened to tear them both away. The boards beneath her knees splintered, water rising to claim them, but she clung with every ounce of strength she had never known she possessed. Thomas was there in the next heartbeat, his grip seizing Eleanor's arm, hauling both child and woman back onto solid ground. They collapsed together in the mud, rain pelting their faces, Clara sobbing into Eleanor's chest. Eleanor held her as though she were her own, trembling not from fear but from the overwhelming clarity of the moment. She had risked everything, not because duty demanded it, but because love had already claimed her. Thomas watched, chest heaving, his eyes fixed not on his daughter but on the woman cradling her. Something broke in his silence then, though no words left his mouth. Instead, he reached out, brushing Eleanor's soaked hair from her face with a hand as reverent as prayer. For the first time since burying his wife, his gaze softened into something that carried hope. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean, though the air still trembled with what had been revealed. They returned to the ranch in silence, yet it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of something being built, brick by careful brick, without hurry yet without doubt. That night, as Clara slept nestled between them by the fire's glow, Thomas finally spoke. His voice was rough, as though unused to confession. "She chose you before I did," he said softly, eyes fixed on the flames. "Maybe that's the truest kind of choosing." Eleanor looked down at the sleeping child, her small hand curled against her own, and felt a swell in her chest unlike any she had known. Belonging. Not given by letters or contracts, not measured by strength or beauty, but born of love freely offered. The town would still whisper, she knew. Mrs. Boone would still sneer, and the eyes of strangers would still weigh her worth. Yet none of it mattered as it once had. For in this small circle of firelight, she had been claimed not by demand but by grace. Outside, the storm had left the world hushed, the air heavy with the scent of rain and earth reborn. Eleanor leaned back, eyes closing, and let the silence hold her. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since stepping from that train, she did not fear it. And as the night deepened, she carried with her the echo of a child's voice, the steady presence of a man who had begun to see her, and the quiet certainty that sometimes, when the world turns you away, love finds you anyway, in the most unexpected of whispers.